All right, so now we're getting into it. How to make observations and how to keep a Billings Ovulation Method chart. Now, in Billings Ovulation Method, we are observing daily throughout the day as you go about your normal daily activities. The first thing that we're paying attention to, and the most important observation, is the sensation at the vulva. And what we mean by that is specifically what you sense at and by the vulva as you go about your normal daily activities. So we're not doing anything unusual, we're not doing anything extra, we're just paying attention throughout the day to what we feel at the vulva. Now, that may sound a little bit odd, but if you think about it, and if you think about when you start your period, you know because you feel it, right? You feel that difference in the moisture. That's the same kind of thing that we're looking for. It may not be quite that dramatic, but it's the same kind of feeling. So that's what we're looking for most often. Now, we also do pay attention to the appearance of any discharge that we might happen to see, but this is definitely a secondary observation. If you happen to see anything in your underwear or on the tissue when you're going to the bathroom, you can take note of what it looks like. But most importantly, we're trying to figure out that sensation. Now, it's important to know we do not do any internal investigation, and we also do not need to douche or to clean at all. All right, so you're going to focus on the sensation at the vulva throughout the day. Some great questions to ask yourself. Has anything changed? Is the sensation the same? And then you make a mental note throughout the day. And then at the end of each day, right before you go to bed, you will write it down on your chart. And you're going to write down the most fertile characteristic of the day. So the more wet it is, generally, the more fertile it is. Okay, so we don't have to worry about, oh, well, I was dry in the morning and then part of the way through the day I felt this and then part of the way I felt that. We just need one sensation. So whatever the most fertile characteristic of the day is, that's what you will write down on your chart. And again, remember, the sensation at the vulva is the most important of the observations. All right, now in Billings, we get to use our own words. You don't have to pick from a word bank that we give you. We want you to feel the sensation and then decide what word makes sense to you. So I'm going to give you some words that you can use that we see often, but if these do not fit your sensation, please feel free to use your own words, okay? All right, so number one, dry. Dry is a perfectly valid sensation. If you're not feeling anything, you're not doing it wrong, you're not missing anything, it's just dry. It's a sensation of nothingness. So we don't think about dry as like itchy or uncomfortable. It's just, I didn't feel anything, so it's a dry day. Some women feel sticky or moist, wet, and slippery. Now, slippery is one that we do want you to use either slippery or a good synonym of slippery because the other wetnesses are a grade of wetness. They are between dry and a little bit more than dry, and then maybe you're feeling a little bit more, and then like you feel like you peed your pants, but you know you didn't, and that's the wet. And then you've got slippery. And slippery usually has a lot of wetness involved with it, but it just has this extra slippy, slidey feeling. And so you need to be on the lookout for that slippery. It's like the difference between, say, like washing your hands just with water and then washing your hands with water and soap. Both are very wet, but the slippery just has that extra slippy slidiness to it. So it is important that you use the same word to describe the same thing. Don't get too creative with your words. If it's basically the same sensation, use the same word. And if you find yourself and you're thinking really hard and you're thinking, maybe it's a little more, I don't know, don't worry about it. It's the same thing, just write the same word. But those changes, you will notice a difference. You'll be walking around one day and you'll feel something that you did not feel before, and that would get a new word. And we want to remember, please keep it simple. You don't have to get too creative. Please don't write me an essay. I don't want to read it. Just 1 to 2 words, and that's all we need. All right, now if you happen to see any discharge when you're in the bathroom, you can also describe its appearance. Now, it's important to realize that some women never see anything, and they are still cycling normally, and that's perfectly okay. But sometimes we do see something, and discharge is defined as anything that leaves the vagina. All right, so if you happen to see any discharge, you can write it down. And again, make up your own words, but here are some common ones that we see used a lot. Is it clear? Is it cloudy? Is it white? Are there strings? Is it thick? Is it thin? All of those things can give us an idea of what's going on hormonally. But try not to get too hung up on those visual observations. They're important, but they're not nearly as important as the sensation at the vulva. You never need to pick up the discharge or stretch it around or do anything like that. Just what you see is all that we need. Again, use your own words and please keep it simple. All right, now in Billings, we have 6 stickers and they are different colors. So we're going to go ahead and go through those. If you use an app, these same stickers are on the app. If you're using paper charts, your instructor will send you those stickers as well. All right, so the first sticker is red. Now, red, very logically, is for any kind of bleeding. There are lots of different kinds of bleeds, but whatever it is, if it's bleeding, use a red sticker. If you have very light bleeding and it could be categorized as spotting, you can draw spots on the sticker, or again, if you're using the app, there's a way to put those spots up on there as well. All right, now we have green stickers. Now there's a little rhyme that goes along with green. Nothing felt and nothing seen, that's the day to use the green. So these are the days that there is nothingness. You don't feel anything, you don't see anything, and then we would use a green sticker for that. And now we have yellow stickers. Now yellow stickers are given over time. It's not a stoplight. It's not a maybe day. We don't do maybe days in Billings. It is just as infertile as green. It's just indicating that there is discharge that you either see or feel. And we've determined over time that it is not fertility. So that will be the yellow sticker. And then we have our little white baby stamp. The white baby stamp is used when we have potential fertility or possible fertility on your chart. Then we have marking a peak day. Now I'll teach you how to do a peak in just a minute, but when we do recognize peak, we put an X on that day. And then we've got the little colored baby stamps. Now these confuse everybody. So we have the green baby stamp and the yellow baby stamp. These are only used 3 days in a cycle. They're the 3 days right after the peak that is still fertility, but you'll be experiencing discharge that is not wet or slippery, and so it'll be either green baby for dry, nothing felt and nothing seen, or a yellow baby for some kind of a low moisture discharge day. And then we do mark acts of intercourse on our chart with an I. Now Billings also has a series of symbols that are shown at the bottom of the screen. These are very helpful when you are teaching someone who does not have access to either the app or to using the paper charts. If they're just using paper, they can use these symbols. But otherwise, we do encourage the stamps just because the colors are a lot easier to see and to immediately recognize and understand. All right, so when you're first learning to chart, you're only going to use 3 stamps. All you get is the red stamp for bleeding, green stamp for nothing felt and nothing seen, and white baby for everything else. Okay? So stick to those 3 stickers, red, green, and white at first. So again, at the end of the day, after you've been paying attention all day, you will write down the most fertile characteristic of the day. Write down the sensation at the vulva first, and then the appearance if you happen to see anything. So in this case, this woman wrote down moist, cloudy, and she had a white baby stamp on that day. And again, please keep it simple. 1 word for sensation, 1 word for discharge if you see it. And if you must put a 3rd word, maybe, but try and keep it to 2 words. 1 or 2 words is perfect. All right, also, if you happen to notice that your vulva feels a little bit swollen one day, you can write that down as well. Now, the boxes on our charts are really tiny, so you can abbreviate it to SV, or if you can fit all swollen vulva in there, go for it. And it would be great on your chart if you can also note any changes in your daily routine. Things like extra stress, and stress not only being emotional stress, but also stress on the body. So if you were starting a new workout routine, that kind of thing would be extra stress on the body. If you're traveling or if you're moving and you're carrying tons of boxes around, that would be stress on the body. So if there's any stress, if there's illness, if there's any medication changes, including vitamins, any travel, breastfeeding changes, baby sleeping through the night, that kind of thing, it's a great thing to put on your chart as well. All right, so you will begin your chart today as day 1. And then you'll make a follow-up appointment with me in 2 weeks, and we'll be able to look over your chart and check and see how things are going. All right, so what can a cycle look like in the Billings Ovulation Method? We're going to go through an example so you can see kind of how these stamps work and how the observations are charted. So we usually will start a chart with menstruation. Now we know that it's menstruation when there has been a peak preceding it, and we'll get into that a little bit more later as well. So you start day 1 with the first full day of bleeding. You can see on the screen that she had wet, wet, moist, moist, and then a dry spotting day. It's important that you still write down your sensations even during menstruation. Now, a lot of the time that's just going to be wet, and that's okay. But as specifically as you get lighter in your menstruation, you'll want to make sure you're taking advantage and thinking about what kind of sensation you're having on those days as well. It is possible for ovulation to happen very early in a cycle, as early as day 5. So those lighter days, it's really important to note what you are sensing at the vulva then as well. Now, after menstruation, we go into a time of infertility. We call this the basic infertile pattern. Now, the BIP, or the basic infertile pattern, is variable. It can be short, it can be very long, it can go back and forth each cycle, and the woman is still healthy and still cycling normally. So in this case, this woman has a dry basic infertile pattern. It's an unchanging pattern of dry every single day, 5 days in a row, dry, 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 dry. Now, dry is a very easy BIP to recognize, but there are also other types of BIPs. Not everyone gets the easy dry BIP. So in the case that you never have dry, never fear, Billings covers that as well. So in this case, and these are great examples, a woman has her menstruation and then she experiences sticky cloudy for 3 days in a row. So at first, remember, you're sticking to those 3 colored stickers, red, white, and green. And so she charts sticky cloudy with a white baby stamp. All right, so she charts all the way through that cycle. Then next cycle comes back around. She has her menstruation, and then we see the same thing again, sticky cloudy. So she charts through that first cycle, and then comes back around, charts her menstruation, and then we see the same thing again. We see sticky cloudy several days in a row. And so now we're starting to think, I'm starting to see a pattern here where after menstruation, she has sticky cloudy consistently. So she's starting to use those yellow stamps in this case, but these days are not available for intercourse just yet. Third cycle, same thing, charts all the way through, then comes back around, charts menstruation, and we see sticky cloudy again. Once we see 3 cycles in a row like this, where we see an unchanging pattern after menstruation, we can now identify that sticky cloudy is this woman's BIP, and those days will become available for intercourse under the rules, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, it's either 3 cycles in a row or 2 weeks of an unchanging pattern when we have a long cycle. All right, in any case, the BIP is that unchanging pattern of discharge. You have menstruation and then you have the same thing day after day after day. Is today the same as yesterday? Yes, it is. Keep writing that same word. And then you'll get to this day. You'll be walking around and all of a sudden you will feel something that you definitely did not feel over here. That is a point of change from the BIP. And that means that your hormones are starting to rise, which means something is going on and you may be moving toward your ovulation. So we would mark that first day of change with a white baby stamp. It is potential fertility. Now at this point, what we like to see is a good changing pattern of fertility. We want you to get a little bit more wet each day, working up toward slippery. And so in this case, you can see she went from moist cloudy to moist clear to wet clear strings to wet slippery clear and then slippery, and she noted the swollen vulva on day 15. All right, so what we're looking for here is called the peak of fertility. Now it's important to note that ovulation is not necessarily on peak day. It is either on peak day or 1 to 2 days after the peak. Now, to identify peak, we are very specific. Other methods do use the word peak. We identify peak very specifically. We have to have 3 things to make sure that it is actually a peak. So, requirements for a peak. There must be a changing, developing pattern that ends in slippery and is followed by an abrupt or a drastic change. Changing, developing pattern, ending in slippery, followed by that drastic change. That is what we're looking for. If we're missing any one of those 3 things, it's not a peak. It's something else. And the rules will account for that as well. So we want to make sure we identify peak correctly because the rules change over here quite a bit, and we want to make sure that we identify this. So here's some examples of things that would not be considered a peak. Say you have a random day or two of slippery, and then it drops off again. Not a peak, because we didn't have that changing, progressing pattern showing us that the hormones are changing and developing up higher as well. Say you've got a good changing, progressing pattern, you get all the way up to wet, and then it drops off. Not a peak, because we didn't get to slippery. We've got to have that slippery sensation. It tells us, again, something going on hormonally that is very important to make sure and to guarantee that ovulation is taking place. Or the third example, say we have a changing, progressing pattern. You get all the way up to slippery, but then it steps down to wet, and then maybe down to moist, and then down to dry. If we have kind of a hill, then that also puts ovulation into question. And so we would not call that a peak, because we want that big drastic change. That tells us that the progesterone is doing what it should when ovulation has happened. So when we have this combination, changing, progressing pattern, ending in slippery, followed by that drastic change, we know for sure that peak has taken place and that ovulation has happened. All right, so here is our example. We've got a great, again, changing, progressing pattern. It ended with slippery on day 15, and then she dropped off down to dry. Now, it's important to note that this drop off, it doesn't have to be all the way to dry, but it should not be wet or slippery any longer. So she marked that day with her green baby stamp and went back, marked peak day, and started to count 1. So that peak, again, it comes at the end of that changing, developing pattern, ending in slippery. It is recognized the day after it occurs, of course, because you don't know it's the last day of slippery until the day after, when it is no longer slippery or wet. And you mark that X on the peak day, on the last day of slippery. All right, so you can see that she got up to slippery, she dropped off down to dry, and then had 2 dry days and then a sticky yellow day. So that's a day that she used the yellow baby stamp. Again, still very drastically different than this day. It's no longer wet or slippery. So she counts her 1, 2, 3. And again, remember that ovulation can happen on peak day or 1 to 2 days after the peak. And that egg lives for 24 hours. And so you give a full 24-hour window at still fertility until fertility is over. Now, once you've had a peak and you've counted your 1, 2, 3, fertility for this cycle is done. It cannot happen again. It is physiologically impossible for you to ovulate over here without a bleed in between. So once you've had a peak, and that's why we're very specific about what is a peak and what is not a peak. So once you have a peak and you count your 3 days, fertility is over, and we enter into what's called the luteal phase. Now, unlike the BIP that can change every month, the luteal phase will be pretty consistent. A good healthy luteal phase is between 11 to 16 days. But if you're always 15 days, you'll always be 15 days for the most part. Every once in a while, it may change by a day here or there, but it'll stay pretty much the same. And over here, you may have a little bit of discharge. So it will not be the same thing as your BIP. Over here, if you have little rises in discharge, that is okay. Just mark them with that yellow stamp and just keep on going, waiting for menstruation to come.